Hey, welcome back to the Conservation Cooperative. I'm your host, Chris. It's great to be back after a hunting season hiatus. Before we get rolling, I just have to say thank you. We have been absolutely blown away by the response to the show. Other than posting on the New York and New England chapter Instagram accounts, we've done pretty much no marketing, so it must be you, the audience, that has been sharing it with friends. We really appreciate it. In this episode, we are talking about a field within wildlife and natural resources management that is playing an increasing role in how state, federal, and even NGOs are making informed management decisions. It's called human dimensions. For the best and longest lasting outcomes, wildlife managers have to consider more than just wildlife and habitat. They must also factor in humans, the things we might want or need, our relationships to animals in the natural world, and even how we relate to other people. It brings to the table a lot of different types of information. I suspect that if you're listening to this program, you're probably well aware that the pressure on wildlife agencies from the public has seemingly been turned up to the max. Perhaps the combination of the rise of social media and a growing disconnect from the natural world, plus the efforts of some to harness these changes to dismantle our model of conservation and how many of us stay connected to the natural world through things like hunting and fishing. Although it's a pretty wide-ranging field, we'll try to keep things focused on examples of how human dimensions work is being used in the Northeast. Let's start with a definition for human dimensions. This one comes from Colorado State University. All right, here goes. An area of investigation that attempts to describe, predict, understand, and affect human thought and action toward natural environments. Let me say it one more time. An area of investigation that attempts to describe, predict, understand, and affect human thought and action toward natural environments. Let's talk to an expert to build on that.
I'm Josh Morse. I recently finished my Ph.D. in the human dimensions of wildlife at the University of Vermont. In my 9 to 5, I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. My Ph.D. and the research that I'll talk about today is separate from that job.
Again, for the record, Josh is not speaking to us as a representative of Vermont Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, so human dimensions of wildlife management, it's the whole set of approaches that social scientists use to understand why people care about wildlife, why people care about wildlife conservation or management, and not just the why, but what their preferences around wildlife conservation and management are as well. And it uses everything from surveys that are really quantitative, that capture a representative sample of the people who live in an area, to interviews that are very qualitatively rich, and that go intentionally to capture specific different perspectives, as well as kind of more emerging methods, characterizing what's being said on social media, or trying to get people to tell stories, or analyzing the photos that people are taking and putting out into the internet. So human dimensions is a big field, but all the approaches out there share that goal of understanding why wildlife matters and what people's preferences around wildlife conservation and management are.
A thing to keep in mind about human dimensions is that, in a lot of ways, the field is still evolving, but its foundation are social sciences like sociology and social psychology. The academic departments that house human dimensions, particularly those that offer graduate programs, give their students flexibility to craft their coursework, allowing them to better hone in on the questions they're asking in their research. Meet Jody Simoes. He too has a Ph.D. in human dimensions and currently serves as the Human Dimensions Project Coordinator for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife.
My graduate education, that was focused 100% on human dimensions research. So my specific project was working to understand recreational angling in the state of Michigan, and I was going to school at Michigan State University. It's pretty customary in a lot of graduate programs to sort of pick your own curriculum. You got to meet some basic core requirements, but you're drawing on courses that are going to help you write your thesis or dissertation. So for me, I was drawing statistics courses from the math and psychology departments. I took several courses in the business school. A lot of my marketing courses came from the business school, and I think that's really reflective of how multidisciplinary the field is. Right, you're studying human behavior, you're drawing on theory from psychology and social psychology, survey methodology, that's vital to the work you're doing. Statistics are vital to the work you're doing. Market segmentation, essentially, that's what you're doing. You're looking at these markets, at customers, and you're trying to understand them, segment them. So I feel like I cobbled these courses together across a big campus. And so I spent a lot of time in many different departments, not just the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, but it was exciting. It was exciting to walk around in the business school wearing Carhartts and a flannel. And, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Now we know what human dimensions is in theory. Let's look at how it's used in practice, starting with Josh's dissertation and then looking at some of the day-to-day stuff Jody might do at the agency. The study that Josh completed for his dissertation, and which was later published in the journal Conservation Science and Practice, was related to improving coyote management. His study focused on rural Vermont and used what is called an ecosystem services framework, which basically focuses on the idea that nature or even individual species somehow contribute to human well-being. Given the complexity of many human-animal relationships, he used an approach that was significantly more labor-intensive than conducting surveys to understand human-coyote interactions.
I did a study that was very different from your typical wildlife value orientation survey. I used a small sample that was selected to capture a wide range of experiences, but not necessarily a representative slice of the Vermont population. And I didn't ask about specific policy preferences or specific philosophical beliefs. What do you think is important about wildlife? Instead, I asked people to tell me stories about specific interactions they had with coyotes. What I wanted to learn from those stories was, what are the costs and benefits of living on a landscape with this species that gets talked about a lot, that is kind of the center of some nasty policy debates, but that also is pretty common and that people do have memorable experiences with. And then to try to categorize those costs and benefits using the ecosystem services framework. So giving policymakers something more concrete than people love coyotes or people hate coyotes. That's really important, I think, from a wildlife management perspective, because if you boil managing or conserving a species down to do we love them or do we hate them, you're going to end up with some very misguided policies. Wildlife managers, even hard scientists, I think, have an innate appreciation for how complicated and how much gray area there is in people's relationships with wildlife as populations and as individual members of those populations. And so that's something that ecosystem services was a good tool to look at, and that interviews rather than surveys were a good tool to look at, because interviews, especially when they're kind of framed as a story, give the storyteller a chance to shape the conversation and shape what is important.
A narrative ecosystem services assessment is a relatively unique approach, and as you might imagine, it's time-consuming. But skilled researchers like Josh can use it to identify important themes in the data that might not otherwise rise to the surface using conventional survey questions. If you're interested in Josh's study, I've included a link in the show notes to his journal article. Definitely check it out. While Jody occasionally takes on unique research projects, his day-to-day work for the state agency is much different. Most of the work he does fits into two buckets, either working with data the agency already has at their disposal or conducting new surveys of the hunting, fishing, and trapping community.
It really, the type of work really runs the gamut. I may be tasked with pulling information from our licensed database just to inform an email, a piece of outreach to a particular customer, right? So I'm turning towards our licensed database, drawing out the customers that we want to contact, and providing that to biologists, to our outreach staff, that kind of thing. So that's maybe the simplest task that I have. We have a variety of surveys that we do. So we have an annual hunter survey, and that's been going on before I started working. I think that started about 10 years ago in 2014 with one of the early deer biologists really spearheading that annual hunter survey. So that collects primarily resource use. So how often folks are hunting, where they're hunting, the type of game that they're targeting, but also it collects opinions, preferences, things like that of hunters. So that has been a real staple of Mass Wildlife, that annual hunter survey. It's capturing information across a lot of different species. And one of the things we're trying to do is to narrow that down, make sure that all of the questions we're asking are vital for that survey, trying to reduce the length, reduce the cognitive burden of that survey.
In 2022, Jody, along with the Fisheries team at Mass Wildlife, conducted the first angler survey in over 25 years. The data from the survey has already informed fisheries management and how the state fisheries resources are allocated. The survey, which continues to be refined, captures data on time spent on the water, preferences related to species, water body types, fishing methods, and much more. As we learned in our brook trout episode, other states like New York have relied heavily on angler surveys. They've been able to identify significant shifts in the values of their customers and have been able to adapt their management accordingly. Government agencies aren't the only ones relying on human dimensions research to inform management and public outreach. Some NGOs are leaning in as well.
My name is Shelby Perry. I'm the Wildlands Ecology Director at Northeast Wilderness Trust. Sure, yeah. Northeast Wilderness Trust is a wilderness land trust. We work across all of New England and Eastern New York, and we protect land as forever wild. We're the only regional organization protecting forever wild land in this region. And we do it through buying land in fee and also purchasing sometimes conservation easements on land. And my role is sort of new to Northeast Wilderness Trust. I made it kind of a couple years ago. And it's about looking at the science of wildlands and forest ecology and how, as it applies to our work, and sort of distilling it and helping us communicate our mission and our conservation work through a scientific lens.
In case you're wondering what Shelby means by forever wild, the Northeast Wilderness Trust follows principles that are inspired by those that guide federal wilderness areas. For a deep dive on those concepts and the history behind them, I highly encourage you to check out the podcast series, How Wild from NPR. Anyway, Northeast Wilderness Trust is a lot different than most other land trusts that people come in contact with. They take a de-emphasized approach to recreation. After acquiring land, they don't build trails, create parking lots, or anything else that draws people to visit the properties. That difference alone can complicate relationships with potential funders and even within the communities their properties are located. So, as one might imagine, having a better grasp of the social side of conservation could be really useful. Shelby and her colleagues have already seen the value of human dimensions research through some of their cooperative work with other organizations.
There are a bunch of ways in which we've acknowledged a need for more, and some of those are in the ways that we communicate and talk about wilderness. So being part of the CRC, which is the Cougar Research Collaborative, we did through that collective commission specific social science on the issue of cougar restoration. Northeast Wilderness Trust, for sure, not advocating reintroduction, staying out of that issue entirely. This is like a fascinating exploration of the science, and going through that process really opened my eyes to how helpful it is. So now I am looking at ways to apply it in other facets of our work. And some of the ways that I've looked at it are in sort of the language we use and the way people react to the language we use. We try to be very intentional with our language at Northeast Wilderness Trust and not use terms like natural resources or, things that are sort of a human focus. They sort of imply that all of nature is here sort of in service to humans. And so we're sort of trying to turn that narrative on its head sometimes and have conversations about humans having a place in sort of the greater biotic community, but not necessarily being at the top of a pyramid.
To do that in rural communities where the way of life and how people make their livelihoods is so connected to the land has to be a difficult needle to thread.
You'd think we would be some of the easiest neighbors, right? Because people hate change. And when you protect land as wilderness, it's basically just going to be the same thing. But there is a long history of management, active human manipulation of the landscape around here. And a lot of people are raised believing that that is the way to treat the land, and and have not encountered an organization that intentionally does not do that. Everything we do is in the confines of the human community. And in some ways, it's almost harder to take an ecocentric approach within our property lines when they're embedded in human communities without considering that broader human reaction to what we do. I don't know that pressure from the human community surrounding changes what we decide, but it often changes how we talk about it.
Essentially, as a private landowner, Northeast Wilderness Trust isn't beholden to the public, or any public input process for that matter. But Fish and Wildlife agencies, along with state and federal land managers, do need to involve the public in their decision-making process. And as I pointed out at the beginning of the show, these days, it seems like there's a lot of noise around some of these decisions. There are dozens of recent examples where vitriolic comments, shouting matches, out-of-turn statements, and ineffective meeting management from officials has gummed up the public input process. Now, don't get me wrong. We can't abandon any part of the public input process simply because it's become messy. But we have to recognize that for the actual decision makers, the task at hand has become increasingly difficult. Human dimensions professionals like Jody believe they can provide important information in these types of situations. Jody explains.
One of the really valuable things with conducting a scientific survey is to go beyond and move beyond the public hearing where you end up in these shouting matches between conflicting user groups. That's one of the more common issues that agencies are trying to get an answer to. My response is, let's get a representative sample of the user group, and let's try to understand from that information where the sentiment is, how large these different user groups are, and then make the management decisions based on that. And in some cases, maybe it's Pollyannish, but it could be an issue of educating folks. If the perceptions are wrong or they're not reflective of the biological reality, let's understand that knowledge base, those opinions, those perceptions. Let's understand them, where they come from, and then try to educate based on that information.
Impactful and durable management policies are, of course, the product of great science. Understanding species and habitat will always be a cornerstone to achieving conservation objectives. But managing people? Well, that's a big part of it too. Hopefully, this episode has given you some insight in the process that we all are taking part in as we work on behalf of our public lands, waters, and wildlife. Big thank you to our guests, Josh Morse, Jody Simoes, and Shelby Perry. Also, thank you for listening. Music for this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to stay plugged in with all the stuff we're working on over at BHA. You can find that on our website or on social media. The New York and New England chapters have a lot going on, so stay connected with us. Also, we have some big fights in 2025, and we need your support now more than ever. Please become a member, make a donation, and answer our calls to action. That's it. We'll catch you on the next one.